In our Wednesday night conversation at church last week, which is where I actually begin these conversations, we didn't finish Luke chapter 11 like we've been trying to get through a chapter each week. I think the material in Luke is getting rich enough that we probably won't finish an entire chapter each week from here on out. I'll do my best. But there's enough material in here that I think it demands a little bit more conversation, a little bit more in-depth on some of the issues involved. So bear with us as we go through that and use these conversations as you see fit. We begin chapter 11 this week with his disciples asking Jesus to teach them to pray. Now, you may have noticed as we've gone through Luke, Luke has noted numerous times that Jesus has gone off by himself for apparently long periods to pray. And I think his disciples have noticed that, and they feel the need for him to teach them. Prayer, of course, is going to be one of the most important activities for any of the disciples. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, we find out that the early church devoted itself to prayers. And later on in Acts chapter 6, when the apostles themselves begin to define their ministry, among the other activities they're supposed to engage in is prayer, and they're to devote themselves to that. Prayer certainly assumes a close relationship with God. And so Jesus tells this story next about the persistent neighbor. It tells us some good insights into the effectiveness of prayer, but it also is an encouragement for us to come to God in prayer. As we see the story unfold, the man essentially, I would say, is beyond persistent. He's kind of a pest. He will not leave his neighbor alone until his neighbor gets up and gives him what he needs. And as Jesus applies the story, he uses what I think is a fairly familiar statement to some of us at least: ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. That's all about prayer. And it tells us that a number of things. That, first of all, God is personal. He wants intimacy. He wants us to come to him, and he wants us to hear your requests. In fact, number two, I think, is he really invites us to lay our requests before him and have him hear us. And finally, of course, he is a generous, loving Father. Pretty unique characteristics for the supreme being that we recognize biblically, of course, is the creator of the universe, and yet he condescends to hear all of our prayers. Very interesting, very inviting for us to come and lay our requests to that Father. As the story, or as the narrative in this chapter goes along, Jesus has to address some of his critics and his skeptics. Some of them doubt that he is using his power of his divine power to cast out demons. In fact, they don't question that he can cast out demons. They question the power that he has to do it. They seem to attribute his power to some evil forces, something more sinister than divine power. And as we go and look at that particular section, Jesus really kind of skewers their logic here. He just shows them how stupid it is for them to assume that Satan cast out Satan. He also has to deal with the fact that a number of people are asking him for a sign from heaven. Presumably, they're looking for some kind of sign to prove that he truly is from God. And Jesus goes on to say, okay, guys, let's talk about the sign of Jonah here. He says, first of all, an evil generation looks for a sign. And perhaps the great irony here is that all the miracles he's done, including the ability to cast out demonic forces, ought to be signs enough for them. And he's already proven his divine authority, but they just don't seem to be satisfied with that. And maybe one of the lessons here is some people will never be satisfied or convinced of who Jesus is. Jesus says, the one sign you're going to get for an evil generation is the sign of Jonah. And we learn, of course, that Jesus is referring to his own death and resurrection. Pretty good starter conversation, to say the least. See you next week.